This is about Korean democracy, especially the crisis of democracy or decline of democracy. It depends on your analysis. So today the topic is that not democracy in general, but particularly about the bureaucracy. So the title of my talk today is Holding the South Korean Government Accountable. So political control and bureaucratic autonomy. So it's a tension between these two ideas. I don't know how you see the Korean democracy, how it's working, or the state of affairs in democracy. But at least you feel that democracy in general is in crisis across the world. So it's not a crisis in usual suspect like a country in Latin America or country in Southeast Asia or Africa, but democracy is in crisis in the US and in the UK or in other European countries as well. These countries we see democracy is very stable and we don't really see a crisis there. But now we witness that some event, political event, you can see this is a crisis. So 2001, I think, 2001 in January, the people, I would say, a lot of people went into Congress in the Washington, D.C. So it's like a coup. And also, we have a Brexit in the UK. This is a huge mistake, but democracy made a huge mistake. And last week, I went to UK for a meeting, and I see this mistake takes place in the real world. The price is going up, and there is a huge delay in the channel between the UK and France, and the economic situation is very difficult. And this democratic decline or crisis is happening in South Korea as well. So today, I'm going to talk about that democratic decline or crisis with focus on the bureaucracy, especially using the concept of accountability. So we will discuss this bureaucracy, but I hope that you have a chance to understand how the Korean governments work. So one of the reasons you are here is that you also try to understand and learn about the Korean government and the politics and public policy. And I'm sure that you have many chance to listen to the people who explain about the Korean public policies and Korean government. But probably is more like a plain explanation or introductions. But today, I instead of this just introduction, I will give you analysis, a very tense situation of the Korean government, so that you will have a further strong understanding how actually it works and what kind of problem it has. So that is the idea of today's lecture. Well, before I start to talk about the crisis of democracy, I need to talk about Korean transformation, Korean success. So I don't really spend a lot of time on this, but I have to mention because this is a basis for our talk today. Of course, economic development, that is one major achievement. Today, Korean economy is probably 10th largest in the world. Maybe in 2 years or 3 years' time, it will be among G7 countries. I don't know, but if we are doing well, then probably it's going to be G7, or country like Italy and UK falling down, then we can go up. So that is one big transformation. And the second transformation is democratization. Today I'm going to talk about crisis, but of course this is a big achievement. We used to be a very authoritarian government, but the Korean democracy last 30 years, very stable, very consolidated, but that is the second big transformation. And the third transformation, I don't know whether you heard about that, but I think this is very important transformation. In Korea, we have the welfare state. So if you are poor, you will be supported by the government, at least basic income. If you are ill, you will have a public health care. So the welfare state is matching any other welfare state in Europe. It's still small, but it works very well. So this transformation shows that in reality, you can see the Korean response to COVID-19. I think one of the best response in the world is the Korea. China used to say that, but you see the Chinese zero COVID was not sustainable. And the US, probably near to 1 million people died. And other European country, at least 500,000 deaths. But in Korea, I think it's less than 10,000 people or 2,000 people. It depends on how long you measure these deaths. So it's not just government's efforts during the COVID-19, but its basis is the national health insurance. One of the main components of the welfare state is working. Of course, the Korean people follow the rules, and the governments use this institution very effectively. That is the showcase that the Korean public policy is working. Then you may ask me, why then you talking about the crisis? Every 5 years, democratic elections take place, governments change, COVID-19 response was very well. But still, from my point of view, if you look carefully, there are problems. And something you have to tackle, otherwise your democracy is not going to be sustainable. Maybe my expectation is too high. My expectation about Korea is too high. But I'm not satisfied with the Korean, this current state of democracy in the Korean democracy. I recognize the achievement of Korean transformation, but still there is something to be improved, and there is a problem. Let's say, how many Korean presidents was imprisoned after their terms? 5 or 6, I don't know. We have another former president, but he is under investigation as well. This is not very good. If you are a democratic society and after you serve the country as a president, next step is going to prison, this is not good. I'm not going to say if you are president, you are pardoned at any crime you commit. I don't say that. But I say that this situation is not good for president or democracy. And then if you have this kind of experience every time, then the democratic competition, democratic game is not democratic game. It will become struggle for life and death. So there is a vulnerability, weakness in democracy if we continue to have this kind of tragic event. I was hugely relieved when we have every Sunday 1 million people protest in the center of Seoul against the government, and it continued more than 1 month. And I was very, very scared if there is something blood event happen. I cannot imagine what was going to happen to the democracy and society. But we are lucky that time we managed to overcome the crisis following the constitutional rules. But you have to acknowledge that we have an issue of democracy, a democratic crisis. And today I'd like to point out not the democracy in general, but in this democratic handover and some political problems, Korean bureaucracy was caught in the middle. And not only president, but senior officials often accused some wrongdoing, and they also went in prison because of their doing their job, or they are doing their job in a wrong way. That is one. The second issue. The third issue is that even though we respond very well to the COVID-19, but you know that public policy failures, we will see there is a big disasters. Just the last few months, we have young people died in Itaewon, more than 150 people. And years back, we have a disaster in Sewol boat. So if this kind of public policy failures, you cannot sustain your democracy. Democracy is not only about the elections and the change the president, giving a new job to some politicians. Democracy is about, in the end, delivering public policies to the people for their well-being. But if you fail, then your democracy cannot sustain. So instead of the usual people like Stephen Levitsky or any other scholars who are talking about democratic crisis, they are mostly talking about politics and elections. I'm today concentrate on bureaucracy, how this bureaucracy and politics is work, so that you will see the particular point that accountability in the Korean democracy as well. But the question today I'd like to raise is the relationship between the governors, politicians who are elected to the office and the bureaucracy. And what kind of relationship we have in Korea. And if we want a sustainable, stable democracy, what kind of relationship should be like between them? So the point is that between the relationship between the governors, elected governors, and bureaucracy, which we call government. When you say about the government, Korean governments in Indonesia, you include these two people. One is elected governors and bureaucracy. But my point is that you need to separate these two people inside the governments, and what is the relationship between them. And that is the difference by talk to the other scholars who really often talk about democratic crisis in terms of politics. But I like to point out this relationship. And how you analyze this relationship, I bring the concept of accountability. This is, we will have an opportunity to talk about this accountability and responsibility in more detail, probably next spring semester. But I use this concept to understand the relationship between governance and bureaucracy. And there are, in the study of public administration, we have a long tradition of about theory about the relationship between bureaucracy and the president or ministers. And one big theory is political control. So if you are democratic society, bureaucrats must be controlled by the people, and especially by the elected president and the elected National Assembly. Bureaucracy is just a professional job, and you are doing the job, but you are not your own. You must be politically controlled. That is one theory. The second theory is that political competence, so professional competence. If you are bureaucrats, you are not just ordinary people. You must have a competence. You must have an ability to do your job. Do you know that what you are doing? So you should have exercise your competence, and the other people cannot do. And the main idea of the study of public administration is to train people to this professional job. And to be a bureaucrat, you have to pass the exam. So you have to show that you have a competence. These are two main theories showing that the relationship between the governance and the bureaucracy. And my idea is that you don't have to choose one or the other. This is a dilemma. In the bureaucratic society, democratic society, bureaucrats must be controlled in a democratic way. But at the same time, bureaucrats must have a professional competence. When you have a competence, you have to have autonomy. These two things, the relation between these two things is accountability. So, in a democracy, the power resides in the people. So we are the people, and we have an origin of the power, the source of the power. We delegate our power to the people, politicians, president, and the National Assembly, and the politicians. That is the idea of bureaucrats. If it is a kingdom, the king is the power. I don't know whether there is someone from Saudi Arabia, the king. In the UK, they say that the power resides in the king and the parliament, so that they have two sources of the power. But in a democratic society, Republican society, we have people. Then, even though we elected the governments or presidents, we are not giving them all the power. We are only giving some sort of power to the president, and we give power to National Assembly, and there is between check and balance. This is the basic framework of how democratic governments is working. But so far, this check and balance is only between governments and National Assembly and the judiciary. But today we are going to talk about the relationship between elected governors and bureaucrats. That is, I think, a real thing is really there. We often talk about the National Assembly do not really control the governments, and the governments do not listen to the National Assembly and the democracies. But if there is a really check and balance between the governors and bureaucracy, and democracy is really working. And you will certainly ask yourself when you move into senior positions, what I'm doing, not only just making policy, but if you are a senior person in the bureaucracy, you will ask yourself, should I speak my own judgment, or I just follow the order from the ministers? And that is the real questions. And then let's move into in more detail about this accountability and autonomy. I don't know whether you really understand what exactly mean when you say accountability. It is nice word. Whenever you say you should be accountable and there must be accountability, that's very nice. You looks very wise man. But what is exactly accountability? Accountability is about bureaucratic discretion. It's to check about the bureaucratic discretions. Because I said, bureaucracy has a professional competence. When you exercise your competence, you must have a certain autonomy. You decide what you do. But because you are not your own man, bureaucrats your power is delegated to you by the people. So you have to explain what you decide. So you have, in one way, you have autonomy, but at the same time, you must explain what you have done so that you can be controlled. So this is the relation is accountability. So the concept of accountability presumes that you have certain autonomy. If you don't have autonomy, you don't have to have accountability. For example, if you have a child, your little boy, so there is a cake, and he just eats his cake, even though I don't eat while I'm away, and the boy eat the cake. But you don't ask your child to explain why you ate the cake, because he don't have autonomy. It's not his own judgment. So whenever you hold someone is accountable, he must have a certain degree of autonomy. So it's two-way. So that when we are doing our work, our bureaucrats, we are bureaucrats, we have a professional competence, and we have a certain degree of discretion, and but at the same time, we need to explain what we have done. So this accountability has three components. The first was informing. So if you are bureaucrats, and when we try to be accountable, first we need to give information, what we have done. And then someone asks you about your information. The second component of accountability is questioning about the information you gave. The information is about your decision. And the third is judgment. So I listen to your explanation and I decide that you are doing the good job or bad job or you are doing the wrong thing. That's the accountability. So we have these three components. And then there is a condition. When you are going to hold someone accountable, this someone must have autonomy. Then you ask him information, then you ask the questions, then make a judgment whether this bureaucrat is doing the good job or the bad job or doing wrong thing. So that is the idea of the accountability. That is the analytical framework to understand the relationship between elected governors and the bureaucrats. And if this accountability is working very well, your democracy is in the solid foundation. That's a theoretical framework, what I'm going to say about the Korean bureaucracy in terms of accountability. But accountability has two dimensions. One is normative dimensions. So when you have a democratic society, democratic governments, you should have a accountability. And this is a norm relationship between the governments and the National Assembly, but also the relationship between elected governors and bureaucrats. But at the same time, it's not just a norm, but accountability must exercise through institutional arrangement. The most prominent institutional arrangements of the accountability in the democratic society is the relationship between National Assembly and the government. So that's why when you open your National Assembly in the session, you call for the ministers and bureaucrats into the National Assembly and ask them to explain the government's policy. That is the exercise of accountability. But today, I'm not going to say about this relationship between the governments and the National Assembly, but I'm going to say about the relationship between elected governors and the bureaucracy inside the government, and how this accountability works. So let's move into the Korean case. I spent quite some time about this complicated concept of accountability, but this is one way, a kind of example of institutional analysis. I know that you are thinking of your thesis. There is one way to do thesis is the quantitative analysis, statistical data, and you regressions, and you show the relationship between the dependent variables and independent variables. But this is the way to how to do the qualitative analysis. But at the same time, even though you are doing the qualitative analysis, you are not just to describe what happened. You need to have an analytical framework that your readers objectively, in a neutral position, understand what you are saying and how this relation is, you will find out. So I set out my analytical framework to analyze the relationship between the elected governors and the bureaucracy in the Korean society. So now I move into the Korean case. Well, when we talk about the Korean democracy and the relationship between the governments and the bureaucrats, I must start with this developmental state. I'm sure that you are familiar with this concept, developmental state. The government is doing very important job for economic development. That is the essence of the idea of the developmental state. And especially the governments and bureaucrats is highly motivated to implement economic policies to achieve economic growth. The question is that even though many people say that this is unique in Korea, but I say this is not unique in Korea. It's every country try to do that. If you go back to 1960s and 70s, in Africa, Egypt, Tunisia, in India, or in Latin America, every country tried to do this developmental strategy. It's not unique in Korea. But what is unique in Korea is the Korea only successful case. We have a Ministry of Economic Planning Board in Egypt. Probably that's more typical than Korean case. But why the Korean strategy of developmental state was successful, I say, is one of the reasons is the bureaucrats, highly motivated, well-trained bureaucrats. And also in the Korean bureaucracy is they are not only coming from upper, well-educated class, but in the 60s and 70s, Korean bureaucracy came from all sections of the society, from the farmers' sons, poor families, as well as highly educated families and well. So in the bureaucracy is reflect the Korean society. And it was open to everyone, but at the same time, well-educated, highly motivated. I know that I find the UN document they're sending into the Korean governments that you should do that. That is about the developmental state. But you have to be neutral and academic when you're talking about this experience. So if you say developmental state, inevitably you emphasize the economic development, economic transformation. You pay a positive picture because Korean experience resulted in success. But at the same time, if you're looking back, the Korean governments in the 70s and 80s, it was very authoritarian government. We have a tragic history as well. So the same thing you can describe is a bureaucratic authoritarian regime. I don't know whether you are familiar to this concept, a bureaucratic authoritarian regime. It was very, very popular among scholars in the 1980s. This concept came from Latin America. So that authoritarian regime aligned with the bureaucrats and the military and very strong. In Argentina, in Chile, they have this bureaucratic authoritarian regime. In Korea, we have. Now we call developmental state. But the difference between Korea and Argentina is whether you are successful in economic development, in the end, whether you consolidate democracy. But at the same time, in the 60s and 70s, we have this authoritarian regime. But in this authoritarian regime, bureaucrats was not accountable to the people because it was authoritarian. authoritarian governments was not accountable to the people. But it was not very autonomous. It was highly controlled by the president, by authoritarian president, by President Park or President John. And how you control, sometimes central information agencies, sometimes you send the people in prison, oppression. And the trade unions in the society was very, very controlled. Now you see the trade unions are very strong in the Korean society. They can strike, they can protest. But in the 70s and 80s, trade unions were very, very controlled and limited to certain places. And the political freedom in general is very restricted. So in that time, the Korean people is the bureaucratic society, and the bureaucracy is overwhelming them, very dominating. It's not autonomy, but they are dominating the people. But you have to know that these bureaucrats was also controlled by the authoritarian governors. Now, after 1980s, we have this democratic society, and in the 90s and 2000s, while the Korean government is pursuing the economic development, but they are trying very hard to control the bureaucrats. Because in the developmental state, the bureaucracy was very big, and sometimes people say it's overgrown or is dominating. So that democratically elected president was concerned with controlling bureaucracy. It's their main priorities. So in the 1990s, the Kim Il-sung government's trying to making government is small. And one of the major reform under this government is banking sector reform. And now, in the Korean society, nobody really have a cash. Everyone use a credit card. So the government know everything. Yesterday, I submit my tax return, annual tax return. And I went to tax office homepage and I click my number. And there is everything what I did in the last year. Well, it's not very good. But at the same time, it makes a very, very transparent. So if you give someone corrupt money, you will be caught. And you know that there is a big political investigation is going on in the Korean governments, especially the leader of opposition party, because there is a wrongdoing and some probably political corruptions. I'm sure someone will be caught and going into the prison. The reason why is that because this real name banking action. So if you do any economic transaction, you must have a real name. So that is one big reform. So that's make bureaucracy is very, very transparent. So if you receive any corrupt money in the Korean bureaucrats, then you will be caught. The second reform in the Kim Dae-jung governments is that introduction of political control of bureaucracy. So reform of this developmental state. But really what we are, the topic we are discuss today is about accountability in the governments, and the institutional arrangement is introduced in the early 2000s, performance management system. So it's evaluate bureaucratic system in terms of performance, but it's not only just making a evaluation of performance, but it is a process of accountability. So when you evaluate performance of bureaucratic agencies, first you have to give them information. You have to report about your performance and what you have done, what your decisions are, and you report. Then someone in the committee reviewed your report and ask you questions. And after that, they evaluate you, your performance. So you do your job, but you are evaluated. You have to be accountable, and you will be judge your performance. That was introduced in 2001, and the 2006 is reform, improved, and the annual performance management review takes place every year. And this year, I'm a member of this performance review committee, and tomorrow there will be a big committee meeting to decide the final decision about each ministries, how they perform. So if you perform very badly, the minister may be dismissed. So this is very, very important institutional arrangement. So you are not only accountable to National Assembly, but you are also accountable to this performance management review committee, to someone like me. And in the National Assembly, they are talking, they are doing politics, and they're shouting, nothing happened, just to showing off. But because this review committee is really doing the job, the bureaucratic system is accountable, even though this political game is happening in the National Assembly, real thing is happening in the committee, and the bureaucratic autonomy, accountability is working. That is the Korean democracy. And not only ministry and agencies, but the senior public officials are also evaluated. So if you are director level below, you are not evaluated in person, but if you are general director and minister or vice minister, your personal performance is also reviewed. So that there is a senior civil service system. So that if you go up, you are personally evaluated. So that we have these two performance review systems. One is the agency ministries, and the other is a senior service of senior officers are evaluated. So working very well. What's the problem? But if you look carefully, it's not working very well. There are too many reviews in Korean governments, too many performance review, too many evaluations. So you spend a lot of time to be accountable. So it's a waste of time. It's not very efficient. And this review, this is off the record. I reviewed the report, and I mean, this is not just me, but some academic paper say that their analysis, whether this informing report is exactly reflect that what the ministry have done, there's some mismatch. Because inevitably every year the report does not really reflect what minister is doing. The second is that when you review the whole ministry, this is a big ministries, the review time is too short. You don't have enough time to review. But it is annual review, and you are not only working in the government to be reviewed, you have your own job. So you do your ordinary job, at the same time you prepare the report, reviewed, and performance probably is overall. Maybe 5-year review is necessary. Annual review is too often. And the other problem is that the final judgment is not only basis on the review, but sometimes it's a political judgment. Ministry A did a very good job, but he did not listen to President very well, and President did not like him or her. Maybe this final review is not very good. But it's not easy because the review is a political process in any way. So how to what extent do we accept that this political judgment as well, not only this objective review, performance review? And this is the institutional arrangement, but final thing is that you know that every Korean president is only able to serve one term, 5 years. You cannot stand another term. Even though the same party won the election, but if your president is different, is the same new government, and every government's change, so the Korean bureaucracy is too difficult to judge. One president is doing that way, and the next month, new president came, he wanted that way, and if you serve this president very well, but you serve them that his public policy, you will be dismissed. And what's the best way to survive? Just doing slowly, doing not very well, just not too cold, but not too hot, just in the middle. Well, that's the life of bureaucrats. We are just bureaucrats, we have no soul. Isn't that our job? But I don't agree with that. Bureaucrats must have a soul. The soul written in the constitutions. The reason why you are given your job is not because you are elected, but because you have a professional competence. At the same time, in the Korean constitutions, there is a role of the bureaucrats. The power of governments reside in the president and the bureaucrats. It's not only elected president, we say in the constitutions. It's a president and bureaucrats. So you are constitutionally assigned. So you have to be a guardian of constitutions. Even though president has come and go, but you have to use your professional competence and you have to be autonomous in certain way, and you speak the truth to the elected power. But now the Korean bureaucrats is losing their soul. They just in between. Once you have this kind of bureaucrats, your government is not going to be effective. You will make a mistake, and the people will suffer in the end. So too much control after democracy lasts 20 years, but we are losing the professional competence and autonomy of bureaucrats, and bureaucrats is losing their soul. That's the crisis of Korean democracy. Then what's my solution? Well, I think in terms of institutions, we need to improve our performance review system. Not too often review. I think we need to review 5-year term or 3-year term, but more in-depth and giving more time. And we have a lot of things to improve. That is one way to improve the accountability and autonomy. But second thing is that I think the elected governors, especially politicians, they need to understand the bureaucrats is not their tool. The bureaucrats is the part of the governments, and they have a different job. Elected politicians showing the directions, the aim or goal of public policy. The bureaucracy is job of implementations, deliver public policies. So we need to understand this division of labor, and there must be healthy relationship between the control and check. Elected governments control the bureaucrats, but the bureaucrats check the politicians. Their decision must be within the constitution and law. And the bureaucrats must willing to speak the truth to the power. Well, I will stop. We have half an hour maximum question and answer and conversation. So I will stop, but if you have any comments and questions, so that please raise your hand.